Okay, as I said, I'm Sally Thurston from Maynard Public Library, and tonight we are delighted to welcome Joe Bagley to talk about his new book, Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. Just a matter of a technical matter. We'll have a question and answer session after the talk. And we ask you to type your questions in the chat window, which you can access from the bottom, from the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Joe Bagley has been the city archaeologist of Boston since 2011. He's a historic preservationist and a staff member of Boston's landmarks commissions. Sorry. Joe received his bachelor's degree in archaeology from BU and master's degree in historical archaeology from UMass Boston. He has conducted archaeological surveys from the woods of Maine to the Florida Everglades. He specializes in both Native American and historical archaeological analysis. He's also the author of the award-winning A History of Boston in 50 Artifacts. And I will point out that I'll be pasting the link for you to buy Joe's new book for Porter Square Books in the chat. So check that if you're interested in purchasing the book. I think that's all I have. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you so much. And actually, late breaking news, as of a couple of hours ago, I just heard out that the Boston Preservation Alliance has selected the book to be one of its 2021, what do they call it? Preservation Achievement Awards winners. So that was good news to hear today. I'm going to post a link to more information about that. And I think I just did, yep. So if you want to look up the other award winners, and I'm going to get my screen up and going. I'll be right back with the video in 1 second. All right, one more second. There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you to the Maynard Library folks for hosting. We've done a lot of these talks, and it's just great to see that there's still people coming out to them. So I really appreciate it. And so I'm really proud of this book. It was my COVID project. It was due in April, and in late February, I was kind of panicking about what would I do? How would I get this book done in time? I've got so much going on, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to find enough time in the day to get work done. And then March happened, and suddenly I was a full-time book writer. So I was able to really crank out the rest of this book. And thankfully, so much of the data that I need to access is digitized and online, from deeds to probate records to historic photographs like the one you see on the left here, that really made this book doable completely from my basement. I wrote this entire book in my basement remotely, and snuck out for photographs during the shutdowns in order to take pictures of the buildings that went into the book. I want to thank Brandeis University, especially the folks, especially Sue Raymond, the president, the press coordinator, Lillian Dunnage, and the beta readers, including Jennifer, Jean, and Lori, for an incredible amount of work on this book. Jennifer, Jean, and Lori actually edited a longer version of the book that didn't see the publishing. We had to cut back on it to make sure it fit our publishing scale. And so they did a lot of extra work for that version of it. But the book itself came out really nicely, and I'm really proud of how it came out. The folks at Brandeis made a gorgeous book. If you're thinking about writing a work of nonfiction, I strongly recommend that you reach out to Brandeis. They have a fantastic team of people. They made a beautiful looking, feeling, weighing book, and the print quality, paper quality, everything was just fantastic. So any of you that have gotten a chance to actually hold the book and see the book in person, I think would agree. So it should be available at bookstores. Porter Square Book has it. I saw a question early on about whether or not there's any signed copies out there yet. I haven't signed any copies other than my mom's, so there's no signed copies yet. But I'm visible in the community, so if you could bring a book to me someday, I will happily sign a copy. And then maybe someday soon we'll have an actual event where I can do book signings as well. But I want to move a little bit forward into the goals of the book. There are really four main goals. The first one is to celebrate these buildings and to tell an interesting story. I'm an archaeologist. I'm not an architectural historian, but so much of what I do starts with the historic research of properties. Who owned the buildings? Who owned the properties? Who is there? Whose stuff are we about to find when we do a dig? Typically, our buildings aren't there anymore. This book kind of comes with the added benefit of actually still having the buildings, although you'll see at the very end of this, maybe not for very long. But the goal in this book is to tell an interesting story about each one. I also want to educate in general about the historic preservation world that I work in Boston, what our rules and regulations are for preserving buildings, and how landmark status is really the one tool we have in the city of Boston beside public outreach, public outcry essentially, to preserve buildings in their historic state or get them back to their historic state. But that's a very high bar to set to get to, where we have to prove above local significance. I'll talk about that kind of throughout this above local significance. And that's kind of the third goal of this book, is to prepare. I wanted to have a significant statement essentially in each one of these chapters. I wanted to talk about why these buildings are significant, hopefully at the above local significant level, so that folks can use that data to hopefully landmark designate as many of these buildings as possible and get them to be preserved. And then last but not least is fundraising. I am a City of Boston employee. I cannot moonlight. I cannot be paid for anything that I do through this book, including taking the author proceeds of the book, so the advance and any book sales. All of that gets turned over to my employer, the Boston Landmarks Commission, and all of the money from anybody who buys a book, any of the money that would otherwise go to me will go to the Landmarks Commission Education and Outreach Initiative. So I got paid to write the book, so I've kind of done my dues, and now I'm promoting it as a tool for the organization I work for within the city of Boston, within the Environment Department. Which is directed by Roseanne Foley, our executive director. So before we go into the first building that I'm going to talk about tonight, I wanted to talk about the differences between the National Register and a local Boston landmark. The National Register is something that people may have seen, or seen signs on the plaques on the outside of buildings that say this is a National Register listed property. Many people believe that the National Register comes with a lot of protections, and the reality is a National Register listing is essentially an honorary title, and a lot of the protections are really limited to if the federal government chooses to do something that would impact the building, like a highway going through a building, or a major public initiative, like a massive development, for instance. But in general, if you have a National Register listed property, you can tear it down, you can move it, you can paint it whatever color you want, you can take off the most important parts of the architecture without repercussion whatsoever, without rules and requirements, unless you're doing it with federal funding. Then local landmark status is a much higher level of status that is a much more difficult process to prove, but it also results in a much higher control over these properties. And many people don't like that, but the reality is that this is a way to keep historic buildings historically accurate and prevent them from being demolished. There's massive districts in Boston that are landmark designated, like Back Bay, Beacon Hill, and that landmark designation and those requirements to keep properties looking historic has kept those neighborhoods looking the way they do still. And then individual properties like Faneuil Hall, Old State House, those are properties that you cannot change too significantly. You must preserve the historic character and the original pieces of it, if at all possible. So that's just a higher level of protection, but you have to prove that above local significance. A National Historic Landmark, going back to the National Register side of this image, a National Historic Landmark is just a National Register listed property that has national significance. Most of the National Historic Landmarks in Boston, like the Paul Revere House, like King's Chapel, those are not landmark designated. However, since the city landmark requirements means that it has to be above local, the fact that they are a National Historic Landmark automatically makes them above local. So one of my big arguments that I think we should be doing more of is landmarking the true landmarks in Boston, because in many ways we landmark buildings that are about to be demolished as a way to protect them, and then landmarking becomes kind of punitive to developers, and we don't do enough to preserve or to landmark designate our existing landmarks. It seems like it's only being used as a punishment, and that doesn't make it fair, and it doesn't make it it doesn't really represent the historic significance of the buildings in Boston as well, if we're only going to go after buildings that are about to be demolished. If that makes sense. The rest of the night, I'm going to kind of get off my soapbox for a minute there. The rest of the night, I'm going to feature some of the buildings in the book. The book is organized as 50 chapters, and I go from the first building as the oldest building in Boston, and we go in order of their age to the 50th building. The earliest building is the Blake House, built in 1661. It's not one of the buildings I'm going to talk about tonight, but it's got a fascinating story. The youngest building in the book, building number 50, was built in 1794, which means that every house in the book is pre-1794. 3 of them are 17th century. But we're going to start almost midway through the book and go in order and present them in order by age. We're going to jump forward to the 19th oldest building, the Shirley-Eustis House, which is built in Roxbury in 1746. So the Shirley-Eustis House was built on a small hill overlooking the former South Bay marshes in an area that was once the rural outskirts of Roxbury. For those of you that have driven down 93 or live in Boston or know Boston well, there's an area called the South Bay Shopping Center. Essentially, this house was is still located just west of South Bay Shopping Center, and you can see South Bay on the right side of this image. And that has been filled in since with partially from dirt from the Eustis House. I'll talk about that in a second. In 1746, workers began a 5-year construction project on William Shirley's country mansion during the first of his 2 terms as the governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay in the 1740s and the 1750s. In 1745, between his terms, Shirley gained a claim for capturing the Louisbourg fortress in Nova Scotia from the French. And in many ways, his governorship was kind of a reward for his successful campaigns in Nova Scotia. Shirley's new home was meant to impress, and it was likely designed by architect Peter Harrison, who also designed King's Chapel, which is one of the other buildings we're going to talk about tonight, which is where Shirley worshipped. The home stands on a tall granite basement foundation, and it extends upwards 2 stories and has a partially finished attic. Its oak frame is hidden under massive 2-story flattened column-like giant Doric pilasters, and a wooden block-like coins decorated the corner of the structure. A double flight of stairs on the eastern building, on the east of the building, which you can see on the right photo, I got lost there, lead upwards to the bay-facing entrance under a large 3-section Palladian window with a tall central arch. On the western side, the image on the left, a flight of stairs leads from the former carriage drive to the land-facing entrance, which is surrounded by more coins and an oversized keystone. The original exterior boards were grooved and painted with sanded paint to resemble masonry, but around 1800, these original boards were replaced with plain clapboards. The entire structure is capped by an ornate cupola. So when this building was first built, it really faced in multiple directions. One side of the building, the one that you can see better on the right image, faced the ocean and any boats that were coming in. And the image on the left was what you would see if you approached the building by land. In all angles, this building was meant to impress. Like the exterior, the interior was designed to impress the visitor as well, with an entrance featuring imported marble and a large winding staircase that leads to the 2nd floor. The east side of the house contains a 2-story great hall for receptions and state banquets. In the basements, some of Shirley's enslaved people worked in the kitchen and had their living quarters. Shirley died in the home in 1771, and it passed on to his son-in-law, Eliakim Hutchinson. During the Revolution, Hutchinson abandoned the property and rebels confiscated it, using it as a hospital and barracks during the siege of Boston. After the war, the house had numerous owners, including James McGee, a captain in the China trade. McGee, with his wife Margaret Elliott, remodeled the property in a new federal style between 1798 and 1808, including enlarging the windows. William Eustis was a surgeon during the Revolution and later twice was elected governor of Massachusetts and purchased the home in 1819, where he lived with his wife Caroline. This makes the house the only property in Massachusetts that housed both royal and elected governors. After William's death in 1825, Caroline lived a quiet life in the home and supported the abolitionist movement. Dying at the age of 85 in 1865, she was the longest private owner of the property. So this photo shows the house prior to it being moved in its original location on the top of a small knoll. Soon after Caroline passed away. In 1867, the house was divided into 53 lots, and the interior of the house divided into apartments and moved a short distance to its current location to make room for the planned Shirley Street. The first occupants of the relocated building, the House of the Good Shepherd Catholic Convent, took in so-called wayward or fallen women, including unwed mothers and prostitutes, to give them a stable living space and to keep them employed while living and working in the house through domestic services. Approximately 18 women at the time lived in the house. Half of them were nuns and the other half were forming Magdalines, as they were called, before the organization moved to a new, larger building in Mission Hill in 1871. The clergymen lived alone in the house for the rest of the 1870s. I find it interesting that when it was first turned into apartments, there was 18 women living in the house, and the next person that lived in the house after them was a single clergyman. In the early 1880s, individual renters arrived and multiple working class families occupied the house. An 1880 census shows that most of the home's residents have been born in various New England states, while others have been born in Russia, Baden-Baden or Germany, Sweden, and Ireland. By 1900, most of the families living in the house had been born in Massachusetts or Canada and were primarily of Irish ancestry. These families had probably moved to Roxbury as industrial jobs appeared in the surrounding area. I love this photo because you can see just how many kids were living in and around the property. You got all the little boys hanging out by the fence, the younger girls up on the staircase of the Shirley-Eustis House, and even on the second story to the left of the Palladian window, you can see a couple of kids hanging out, looking out from the windows. This was when Roxbury really became a melting pot of recently arrived immigrants. When the Shirley House Association was formed and purchased the house in 1913, many of the original interior architectural elements that had been removed were found in storage spaces in the house or in the private home of an architect in Bath Bay. These elements have been carefully restored and others have been recreated. Though the building is a National Historic Landmark, it is not a Boston landmark. The Shirley-Eustis House is a property is maintained as a historic house museum with tours provided during most of the year. It should be opening up pretty soon. So we're going to move on to a building that was connected to this one, being the place that Governor Shirley worshipped. So he would have been traveling to downtown Boston. He may have had a second home in downtown Boston, I can't remember, but he would have attended church at King's Chapel and went back to Roxbury. So this is the 21st oldest house, or oldest building in Boston, built in 1750. So Anglicans were an unpopular religion group among Boston's predominantly Congregationalist or Puritan residents. So the first King's Chapel, a 1688 wooden structure, was built in an undignified corner of the town's first cemetery, which is now King's Chapel Burial Ground. So this is a kind of conjectural drawing of what King's Chapel may have looked like with Beacon Hill in the background. I'm not exactly sure what it looked like, probably a little bit smaller and more subdued than what you see here. While the church is located immediately adjacent to the burying ground that shares its name, the two have always functioned independently of each other. The original wood church was expanded in 1710. However, it soon outgrew its footprint, requiring the purchase of land from the town of Boston, which owned the surrounding cemetery and nearby Boston Latin School on the north side of School Street. To accommodate the church's expansion, the school would have to be torn down. There was a great outcry of Bostonians over the planned demolition, which triggered an early discussion in Boston about the separation of church and state. One resident, John Green Esquire, wrote, quote, "A fig for your learning, I tell you the town. To make the church larger, must pull the school down. Unluckily spoken," replied Master Birch. "Then learning, I fear, stops the growth of the church." So a little bit of early 19th century snark. Late 18th century snark. And I don't know who Master Birch is. I tried really hard to find him. I think he's just a member of the community that was also protesting the expansion of the church and the need to tear down the school. So the expansion plans were ultimately successful, and the congregation purchased a lot of land across the street for the new building of the Latin school. So basically they bought land to build a new school in, and that helped justify the tearing down of the older school, although the older school was the 17th century first school in Boston. The new church was built by Peter Harrison, who probably also designed the Shirley-Eustis House that we just talked about. His design called for the use of Quincy granite for the exterior walls. Stone buildings were rare in Boston and included the Hancock Manor, which I discussed in the beginning of the book, and the nearby Cook Mansion, which was located directly behind King's Chapel on School Street. Both mansions were standing when King's Chapel was constructed, but have since been demolished. Because there was no alternative places for the congregation to worship, the current church was built around the original wooden structure, which was dismantled after the stone church was completed. The story is that they basically pulled the old church out through the windows of the new church. The original plan included a stone spire, but funding shortages resulted in the boxy front tower that still remains unfinished to the present. Very little of the 1750 interior has been changed, excluding the paint, which would have been darker and more colorful, including pink and peach tones, than the presently mostly white interior. Still, the building remains one of the finest and most intact examples of a Georgian church architecture in the country. The pulpit is one of the few interior elements from the original wooden building and dates to 1718, soon after the expansion of the original structure. You can just make out parts of the pulpit on the far right. The exterior of King's Chapel features several wooden elements, including massive Doric columns, trim, and wooden balustrade. All are painted a grayish brown in imitation of sandstone. During the Revolution, the church sat vacant. In 1785, it became the first Episcopal church in the Western Hemisphere to convert to Unitarianism, and it remains Unitarian today. At present, the church has an active congregation with regular services and sermons. Though it is a National Historic Landmark, it is not a Boston landmark. The building is open for tours and its interior and crypt, and it regularly hosts concerts, other performances, and community events. For anybody that happens to work downtown in Boston, there's many daytime, quiet kind of community concerts in King's Chapel that you can go to during lunch breaks. So we're going to move over to Jamaica Plain for one of the more underrepresented styles of buildings, not styles, but stories in Boston. These are kind of some of the hidden gems, I would call them, in Boston that people have maybe no idea quite how old they are. This one's Linden Hall in 1755, built in 1755, and it's the 23rd oldest building in Boston. It's lost a lot of its context and its original kind of grandeur from being moved, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it still remains one of the oldest buildings that still stands in Boston. So in 1755, the merchant John Gould paid for the construction of a large home for his daughter Sarah and her future husband, the Reverend John Troutbeck, on a large parcel in Center Street. Troutbeck was the assistant rector at King's Chapel, which we just talked about, and a distiller. Before I go on, I just want to kind of talk about there's so many coincidences in this book, and that's one of the things that really was shocked by when I was writing, was just how interconnected these buildings are. So Shirley-Eustis House was built by the same guy that built King's Chapel. King's Chapel had an assistant rector to the Reverend Troutbeck, who lived in Jamaica Plain. These are three totally different neighborhoods in Boston, and yet they're all kind of connected through the stories of these buildings, which I think is just a nice coincidence. So the assistant rector of King's Chapel, John Troutbeck, was a distiller, a profession frowned upon by some members of the community, including the author of the following poem. There's going to be a little bit of poetry tonight. John of small merit, who deals in the spirit, as next in course I sing. Fain would I treat, as is most meet, this chaplain of the king. His Sunday aim is to reclaim those that in vice are sunk. When Mondays come, he selleth rum and gets them plaguey drunk. So more 18th century snark from the Boston community, and I don't know, it makes me happy. So I was really shocked at finding two small kind of poems about folks and events related to these buildings in the book. So this is the building as it looked prior to it being moved and greatly reduced in scale from the neighboring open space, essentially. So like many buildings that I include in the book, the Troutbeck home was moved to save it from demolition. It once stood near the southwest corner of Center and Pond Streets, with grounds extending far back to Jamaica Pond. In its original setting, the house was just 2 stories tall and had a hipped roof and end chimneys, with 2 large wings on either side, creating a monumental structure. The estate featured an expansive lawn down to Jamaica Pond and was known to have large linden trees along the walk to its entrance, giving the name Linden Hall. You can see some of the linden trees here. So Jamaica Pond is one of the few natural ponds in Boston. Its size, coupled with its ideal distance from Boston, not too close and not too far, provided an ideal setting for wealthy residents to build large estates along its shores. Though the individual properties have shrunk in size over the years, some of the largest homes in Boston can still be found around Jamaica Pond. So in the image here, you can see under the blue star, the original Linden Hall in its original location at the corner of Pond and Center Street. And then the yellow star shows where the house was moved. So it didn't go very far. But what you can imagine before this drawing was created, its original layout was to have the house where it currently is located with the blue star and essentially a large lawn that went downhill behind the house all the way to Jamaica Pond. So if you've been to, say, the Crane Estate in Ipswich, and you saw that large undulating lawn down to the ocean, this is kind of a slightly more subdued version of that, where you had the Linden Hall at Center Street with this large, long, open field that went down to Jamaica Pond, at that time at least, when it was first built. In 1776, Troutbeck and his wife, both Tories, abandoned the property and fled Boston. After the Revolution, a third story was added to the building, and it was converted into the Charles W. Green Academy, a college preparatory school for boys. You got to remember back then, a lot of college prep basically meant getting people ready for either being a lawyer or a religious leader. That was basically the only reason why you would go to college back then. So in 1840, a dancing school was established in the building, which indicates the overall scale of the rooms inside the mansion. The image on the right, which comes from the Boston Athenaeum, wasn't able to include it in the book, including it today in the presentation, but I love it because it shows the back of the building, and we almost never get to see what the historic shape and structure of the backs of these buildings look like. And so just wanted to make sure I included it in the presentation today. And on the left, another great image that shows the overall scale and scope of Linden Hall prior to its move. The city laid out Grosvenor Road in 1890 to just behind Linden Hall, and between 1896 and 1905, the mansion was moved to make way for structures built closer to the street. This early 20th century image shows the corner of Center and Pond Streets where the building once stood, just to the left as the view seen here. After the move, Linden Hall was converted into apartments. This view is essentially the same view that you would see today if you drove by, minus the tracks in the streets. We've gotten rid of all of our trolleys, unfortunately, or most of them. But the buildings on both sides of the street are all still there. Linden Hall is not a city landmark, but it is listed on the National Register as a contributing property to Monument Square Historic District. Though the interior of the structure has been broken up and the windows replaced and vinyl siding added to the exterior, the property is one of the still few surviving grand early homes around Jamaica Pond. Importantly, Linden Hall is not a museum, but it remains a home to Bostonians, the purpose for which it was originally built. And I think that's an important part of the story. Even though it's lost some of its grandeur, it still kept its purpose. As has this one. This is my favorite house in the book, so I'll save you that question now, because I get asked every time I don't mention this one. This is number 36, the Elijah Jones house. It's in Mattapan. It's like half a mile down the street from me. It's the one that gave me the most trouble when I was researching it, because it was just a pain in the butt to find it in the deeds, and it just had some really interesting stories that came up while I was researching. I apologize for my neighbor's dog barking his head off. I have to keep the window open or I will pass out because it's hot in here. So in March 1777, excuse me, I'm going to see if I can shut my window actually, because this is really annoying. Sorry, all. Joys of working from home, right? Yeah, pull my notes back up. Okay. So in March of 1777, during the Revolution, the housewright Elijah Jones purchased 1 3/4 acres of undeveloped pasture from the town of Dorchester and built his house just west of what would become Mattapan Square. Elijah Jones's house is modest in scale with a gambrel roof and 1.5 stories tall. Its central doorway with 3 probably not original window openings in the gambrel roof, and it certainly has, currently has a central chimney that has almost certainly been greatly reduced in size from its original chimney in the 1780s. Most of these 18th century buildings had massive chimneys. The mills immediately to the south of this house on the Neponset River, and you can see in blue, the blue star marks the Elijah Jones house, include the paper making factory of Hugh McLean, an Irish immigrant, and James Boyes. Some of the large factories you can see on the very bottom of the image, where they channelize parts of the Neponset River to go through the mills to power the various machineries. The vast majority of the mills on the Neponset River were paper making mills. So McLean purchased both lots of Jones's property in 1786 and left his estate to his wife Agnes and their son John in 1800. John McLean was a wealthy Boston merchant. His private home was designed by Bulfinch and was located downtown. Upon his death in 1823, he left his wife Anne their house and $35,000. McLean gave Harvard University money to fund a named chair, now called the McLean Professor of Ancient and Modern History. The chair is currently occupied by Emma Dench, a Roman historian and Dame Judi Dench's niece. And for anybody that expected to see Dame Judi Dench come up today, you were psychic. John McLean's will gave large sums of money to the Massachusetts General Hospital as well, and specifically gave the Jones House and the shop to John Boys, the son of James Boys, Hugh McLean's business partner. Because John Boys died before John McLean, the house instead went to MGH. The hospital had no use for the tiny house in Mattapan, and it sold it in 1824 to Amasa Fuller, another papermaker. So even though that took about 10 seconds to read that paragraph, that took me 2 weeks of research to figure that part out, because I couldn't figure out how MGH received the property. I found in the deeds that MGH owned it, but I couldn't find them buying it. And it turned out that it was because McLean gave it technically to his business partner's son, who was already dead, and therefore it went over to Mass General, which was the backup receiver of the McLean funds. And that took a really long time to figure out. McLean's gift to Mass General Hospital, including the proceeds of the sale of the Jones House, went to Mass General Hospital's Asylum for the Insane, which was renamed in 1826 the McLean Asylum for the Insane following his gift. Today, the renamed McLean Hospital facility in Belmont, Massachusetts, is a world-renowned psychiatric hospital. So the sale of this tiny house in Mattapan helped create what is now considered one of the best psychiatric hospitals in the world. The Jones House and a nearby shop passed through multiple paper mill owners, likely used as a rental property and a store, until it was moved in 1907 to the newly laid out Marcy Road, which was then called Whitney Park. So Marcy Road is the street that you can see in this image to the right. The house's original site was then occupied by a 3-story multifamily home, which has since been demolished, and the site now remains an undeveloped parcel owned by the city. So we believe it was moved in order to create a larger building on the lot. And since many of the buildings on the street, on the new Marcy Road or Whitney Street, were about the size of the house, we think it was basically kept and moved because it fit the general scale of the houses on the road. So it's probable that the move saved the house, placing it on a dead-end side street with a modest single and multifamily houses of similar size, an area that has not yet experienced pressure for redevelopment, despite being so close to Mattapan Square. The house is not a Boston landmark or on the National Register, but fortunately there are few threats to its preservation at the moment. So we can talk a little bit more in the question and answer session about how buildings essentially survive the landscape of Boston over time. But what I've seen as a pattern in the book, throughout the book, is really this general idea of these buildings being built, many of them in larger parcels, sometimes very large parcels. And over time, those parcels shrink in size. And one of the things that really threaten historic buildings in a city environment is when the house itself is located a pretty good distance from the street. Because what that means is that there's this kind of desire to build closer to the street in more recent times, especially as urban development is getting much denser. So if these buildings are not moved forward on their lot or moved off the lot, they're seen as essentially in the way of these larger building lots. And since Boston is a growing city, we're going to need to bring in more people and have more housing for people in Boston. So this is going to be an ongoing threat to these historic buildings in Boston because some of them are on larger lots. There's a solution to that, which is to move the building further in the front of the lot, or otherwise arrange the building on the property so that you can maintain the historic character of the streetscape without losing the opportunity to have more density, which we need in Boston. But sometimes developers see it as an easier process to just tear the thing down and build from scratch. Now, my argument with that is if developers can find ways to work within zoning codes and building codes and come up with creative, sometimes beautiful and elegant solutions to restrictions and constrictions of building lots and building codes, they can come up with creative and elegant solutions for how to work with existing historic structures that doesn't require you to develop them. Sometimes the easiest answer doesn't have to be the only answer. And it's Boston. I'm sorry, it's a historic city. You got to work with what we have. And you can come up with a solution that works well for everybody, that still keeps it profitable, but maintains these buildings and the historic character of the city. Which brings me to the last house we're going to talk about. I'm not going to end on a positive note. I'm just going to give you the warning right now. So this is the 41st oldest building in Boston, the Calvin Bird House, circa 1790, which is located on 4 Wendover Street in Dorchester. So tracing the history of this house is difficult due to its connections to the Bird family, whose members owned multiple parcels in the surrounding area, today just northwest of Upham's Corner on the northern end of Dorchester. This is actually a big problem for this house because, like I said before, we have to establish above local significance in order to prove that these houses are worthy of being preserved as Boston landmarks if we want to use the landmark process to save homes. This building is essentially invisible in historic records until the middle of the 19th century, which greatly reduces our ability to prove significance of a building if no one's going to write about it. It's hard to say it's significant if it didn't turn up in any historic records. Other than being old, is that enough for it to be significant? That's more of a philosophical question. I certainly believe that the oldest buildings in Boston are therefore significant enough to be preserved, but that doesn't mean that I don't have that exclusive right to say that as far as it must be preserved. That's up to the landmarks commissioners. The house was probably built sometime around 1790 based on its shallow hipped roof and its large central chimney, but little of its exterior remains, and the house appears to have avoided early photography. Nor does it seem to be in any deeds until 1824, when Nancy Bird purchased 2¼ acres of land from Lemuel Foster, including the house and the barn. I was not able to determine where Foster got the house prior to 1824. So you can see in these images, there's been a lot of additions on the house and a lot of modifications to it that basically make it one of the less visually attractive buildings in the book, probably the least visually attractive building in the book. The Bird family had been in Dorchester since Thomas Bird arrived on the second voyage of the Mary and John in 1635. Their large 17th century house with its 18th century additions, which I show here in the photo, this is not the Calvin Bird house, but an earlier Bird family property, stood at 41 Humphrey Street, just behind this house. In the 1930s, the Bird house was demolished and a smaller single-family home and multiple three-deckers now stand in its place. It is possible that Nancy Bird and her husband Joseph raised their son Charles in the Calvin Bird house, but it was Calvin Bird who purchased the house from Nancy in the 1850s. Calvin and Nancy are likely related, but their exact relationship is unclear. Other than the last name, I don't have any clear connection between the two and all the genealogy I was attempting to do. Mary, Calvin's wife, took over the property after Calvin died in 1895. Facing pressures from developers in Dorchester at the end of the 19th century, Mary Bird began to divide the rear of the property into smaller building lots, and her heirs added wooden storefronts to the Dudley Street side of the property that obscured the front of the house, as can be seen in the map. So the buildings that you see above it, the 1478, 1467, 1475, those are the sizes of the lot. Number 6, 8, and 10 Wendover. Those are buildings that were properties that were divided off of the Bird lot. And you can actually see that Mary Bird, the heirs of Mary Bird, still own those properties and are using these as opportunities to get rental income. And the Bird house, which was sitting in the middle of the lot, far from the street, like I was telling you before, that's a challenge for a lot of these houses. They decided to build in the front of it rather than move or demolish the building. And then you had these kind of a Dudley Street facing properties that have filled in the space in front of the house. Now nearly encased in later structures, the building has no historic designations, and all that's visible of the house to the public is a small portion of the corner of the building, shallow hipped roof, and its large chimney. Sadly, the Landmarks Commissioner did not issue a demolition delay on the Calvin Bird house several years ago when a proposed condo development was proposed at its site. While the BPDA has been made aware of the inclusion of this house in the book, it may be too late to save the Calvin Bird house from what appears to be imminent demolition any day now. So you can see on the thing, it actually says it's under construction, and a timeline below it says that the building permits were issued in 2019. I think the fact that the COVID thing happened last year is the only reason why this building is still standing. I don't think it's going to be standing for very long, though. So I want to end on kind of a slightly more kind of gung-ho point. I've been reading this at the end of all of the presentations. There's a really great speech that was given at the Old South soon after this drawing was created, showing the Old South being saved from the Great Fire of 1872. Right after the Great Fire and the city rallied to save the church, the city was faced with another challenge where the congregation left the church and sold it for scrap, and the building was about to come down just after saving it from the fire. So there was a huge rally inside of Old South where many people came to speak about the building's significance and also generally about historic preservation, which was pretty early for the time. They had just lost the John Hancock building downtown. So historic preservation was really something that was starting to kind of become a thing in Boston. So this is a quote from the speech given by William H. Murray on June 14th, 1876 from inside of Old South in front of the crowd gathered there to try to stop its demolition. What is it that makes Boston? Do your warehouses make Boston? Do your stores make Boston? Do your miles of wharfage make Boston? Do the white sails of your many ships make Boston? Are these the things that make Boston and are chiefly valuable to it? No. These warehouses, these ships, these mansions, these things of iron and wood and stone are only the body of Boston. They are only the iron nerves along which her interior unseen vital self communicates her will. They are only the flesh in which she is living. But Boston is that unseen something, that immortal, sublime, invisible spirit that is not in this building or that building, but which buildings suggest and advertise to the public. And here in this building, there is value beyond any material valuation, because here Boston has her unseen, invisible, loftiest self, suggested and expressed to the public. Take away these expressions of the soul, of the life of Boston, and what, I ask, have you left beyond any other city on the continent? So with that in mind, the fundamental question of this book is, should all these buildings be saved? And based on the Calvin Bird House, can all these buildings be saved? So just kind of parting thoughts. Of the 50 buildings in this book that I include that are the oldest buildings in Boston, only 6 of them are landmark designated. 10 of them are pending landmarks, meaning we've gotten to the point where we said it's significant, and now we just need to get it over the final hurdle, which is a study report that detailed history of the house, that also lists out all the things that have to be preserved on the house exterior, especially, and reviewed by people if they ever get changed. That's a really tall hurdle to get over, because that can take years and a lot of money that we don't have in the city right now, and staff time that we are already booked solid, basically, just to review what we already have landmarked. So we're really kind of struggling right now, frankly, to get things up to the landmark status and to respond to the landmark requests that we get. So with those parting thoughts, I wanted to kind of plea to everyone to find the book, purchase the book, know that the funds, at least a portion of the funds that you spend on the book, go back to the Landmarks Commission. Pick it up at Porter Square Books. The link is going to be posted if it hasn't been posted more than once already. You can also pick it up directly from Brandeis. Always shop independently in local bookstores if you can. And obviously the book is available on most online bookstores, including Amazon, if you'd like that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm hoping that you all have questions, because I'd love to answer them. Hi.
Hey, everyone, feel free to type questions in the chat. So far, we don't have any questions.
Okay. I did get a private request from someone, and I think it's a good question to answer publicly. How did I figure out what are the oldest buildings in Boston? That's a great question. So one of the first things I did was, there's a website called MACRIS, the Massachusetts Architectural, oh boy, I'm not gonna remember all the names off the top of my head. It's been a long day. MACRIS, I'll type it, MACRIS. If you Google that, you'll find it. It's an online database of all of the historic structures that have been documented in Massachusetts. That doesn't mean that they're all included. Those are just the ones that have been inventoried. And so I started with that. I was able to download all the buildings that were included in Boston. I made a ranked order, which immediately gave me kind of the top, whatever you want to call, 100, 1,000, whatever. There's thousands of buildings in Boston inventory. And I basically went from 1 to about 70, and I double checked everything and did original research in order to kind of solidify that top 50 list. The way I was able to essentially prove the date of a construction on a house was going to the deed records, which was really where I found most of my primary sources. And I used the purchase of a property as a property without a building on it, and the sale of a property with the building on it as my bookend dates for when the building was built. And if I was lucky, that was a very small, narrow range of dates. Sometimes there may be decades between when it was purchased and when it was sold. And then I have to use other things like architectural elements. I need to go through probate records to see if somebody passed away while they were owning it, saying I have a new house, or I have a store or something on the property that can give me more information. If somebody is a house right that builds homes and they buy a property and then they sell a house 20 years later, I make a fairly educated guess that they probably didn't sit on a vacant lot for 20 years, that they actually built a house on the house lot that they bought as a house right. So I think that's kind of where I go with the logic behind it. Some of these buildings are really well documented. Like we have no mystery as to when the old State House was built, when Faneuil Hall was built. Some of these kind of larger, more nationally known buildings. But for the others, it took a lot of legwork, primarily through through deed records.
Okay, we have two somewhat related questions. How many of the 50 buildings, this is from Sandy, sorry. How many of the 50 buildings in the book have been moved from their original sites?
I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's, I think, about 10 of them, if I remember right. Moving buildings was not an uncommon thing at all back in the 19th and 18th century. Many people would move whole buildings, parts of buildings. There's a building in the book that's actually reported to be an addition that was built on the back of another house that was then taken off of that and then moved across the town and put in, it's a Dorchester house, and put up in another spot. The Blake House, which is the oldest house in Boston, 1661, it was moved in 1895. And it was so commonplace to have a building moved that the Dorchester newspaper doesn't even mention that the house was moved on a specific date. There's one article that says they're getting ready to move the house and we're preparing the park that we're going to put the house in. Then there's another article 6 weeks later that says we just had our first event in the park in the new building that has been put there. But there's no story that says yesterday a big house walked down the street, because it was just happening so frequently. And actually I was able to find a lot of records in the city's town records where people are going to the town to get permits essentially to move houses. And there were usually about a dozen or two every year. So it's just a really commonplace thing. The way it was done is actually pretty similar to how it's done today, where essentially you use a lever, which is not a new technology by any means, and you lift up the buildings off of their foundations, and you place essentially a cribbing of large wood pieces underneath it to kind of stabilize the house. Think like a Lincoln log sort of thing. Then you place it down onto a sled, and then the sled is rolled on rollers. Nowadays, it's pulled on a truck on the back of a trailer, but back then it would be put on a sled and rolled on rollers, and it would be pulled by a team of horses or oxen or both. So it's a pretty straightforward way of doing things, and not too complicated. You just need a lot of people, a lot of time, and a lot of really large pieces of wood and horses.
All right, so that answers patients' questions of how actually buildings got moved. There's a question from Gail. Might you speak about the Office of the City Archaeologist? Where's it located? And what was a normal day like pre-COVID?
I don't know if we had many normal days, but so I am located in West Roxbury in the city's archives building. I was located on the second floor until Monday. I'm in the process of moving into a trailer in the parking lot as the city's going to build us a brand new archaeology center in the archives building. So look for news about that later in the year. But we have a lab facility where we curate all the collections that we have. We have about 2 million artifacts. And then we have another facility in the building that we wash and sort all of our artifacts. A typical day in the winter, I'm usually studying the artifacts that we dug up the previous summer, trying to write reports and trying to write grants to get more money so that I can hire staff so that I can get people to do work. And in the summer, we're typically digging most of the summer. I dig on city-owned properties and nonprofit-owned properties, and occasionally we do digs that are on private owner land, but if the owner lets us on the property or invites us on the property, essentially, where we can answer some important research questions. So we did a dig in Chinatown that was a privately owned property, but because we wanted to talk about the Chinese immigrants of Boston and their history and how their history matters in Boston, that not all of the history of Boston is is English folks and Irish folks. So that was one of the things that we did for the community, with the community. But I don't have a lot of typical days, and sometimes I get a random call. Maybe you might have heard about it earlier in the year. We got a hole that opened up in Ronan Park in Dorchester that turned out to be a 19th century well that consumed my life for a couple of weeks. We had next week, we have a really big announcement next week that I'm not even allowed to talk about publicly, but it's a pretty big announcement that you'll hear about next week. That's been consuming a lot of my time lately. I've just did this move. We've been designing our new lab. I've been here for 10 years, and it feels like every year it's like an evolving, growing program. And so there's really not a lot of typical days. And that's frankly what I like about archaeology, is I never really know what we're going to do next.
Okay, any other questions for Joe? I think that's everything that's in the chat.
Okay.
Do you have any particular stories you'd like to tell about the process of your research?
Yeah, so one of the things that I really wanted to kind of, if it hasn't become clear so far, I really want this book to look and feel different from many of the history books that are written in Boston, especially in the past, not so much today. I want this book to be a part of 2021, the year that it came out. So when you write a nonfiction work, one of the things you have to do is do the comp titles, which are the comparable titles. And so you have to list out what other books are similar to this that may have already existed in the world, and why do you need to write this book, essentially? And one of the things I was shocked about was the fact that nobody had done an ordered list in Boston, but nobody had also ever included the neighborhoods of Boston, which is just as important as downtown. So I wanted to make sure that this book was an inclusive book to say all of the city of Boston, first of all. But the books that did try to do the earlier buildings in Boston kind of cherry-picked in the city and didn't necessarily do the oldest, but kind of more like the prettiest. So I wanted to do this book strictly by date, regardless of whether or not the buildings look great or not, because I didn't want it to be that type of significance. I just wanted to do, is it old, essentially. The other thing that I wanted to do, because it was bothering me when I was looking through all these research books, was just how much the stories focused on adult white men. And the reason why that happens is because adult white men write history, write it about themselves for each other. And so a lot of the historic documents that I was encountering really were discussing that perspective of these houses. But these houses are lived in by women, they're lived in by children, they're lived in by enslaved people, they're lived in by immigrants. But these are folks that are just underrepresented in historic documents. So I made it a conscientious effort throughout the writing of the book to make sure that I wasn't just talking about the men involved in these stories, that I wanted to make sure that everybody else was also included in this book. I also conscientiously went through to see if the people who were owning these buildings prior to the 1780s, when Massachusetts made slavery illegal, if any of these people were enslavers, because I figured it's 2021, we need to know this information. And I was able to document multiple properties in the book that were places where enslavers lived with their enslaved people. And one of the things that I now want to know is, where were the enslaved people living within the houses, or were they living elsewhere? Because sometimes there was exterior buildings that are no longer present. In the Shirley-Eustis House, they were living in the basement, but maybe they were also living in other buildings as well on the property. And then there's even a building in the book, the Glampian Middleton House in Beacon Hill, the oldest house in Beacon Hill, that was actually built for Black men when it was first built. It's the only house in the book that I believe was built for a Black person originally. And I just thought that was really interesting. And based on the evidence that I was researching, and the History Project, which is a group of researchers in Boston that are focusing on the LGBTQ history of Boston, their original research and my original research combined suggest, although we can't prove it because it's impossible to prove it, suggest that Glampian and Middleton were a gay couple living in the late 1700s in Boston. So there's just a lot more diverse history in Boston than I think people really realize. And for these buildings to survive in and of itself is kind of a minor miracle, to have them be 300 years old or more. And the fact that they still represent this really diverse story of Boston, I think is really important and really interesting. And then the last thing related to that topic, I deliberately avoided a photograph of any adult white men in the book. So when you thumb through the book, you won't see pictures and paintings of adult white men. There are many of them related to these buildings, But I was like, you know what? They're all photographed in every other book that's ever touched these topics. So my book's going to try to include other people. So I've got at the Dillaway Thomas House 4 Japanese exchange students that came to Boston in the 1870s in the first exchange program in Massachusetts and in the world with Japan. So there's a photograph of them in the Museum of Fine Arts collections, and they lived in that house very briefly. So their photograph is included. At the Lauren Greenough House, it was saved by a group of women, and there's a great photograph in the 1920s of them all standing out in the front of the house in their kind of beautiful clothing. So I have photographs of them included. So I've got Byron Rushing at the Dillaway Thomas House as well, who helped save the house. One of the great political leaders of Roxbury. So these are all folks that I wanted to conscientiously say, if I have to show a photo of a person, I want it to be of folks that are otherwise the least represented people in the stories of these buildings and places.
Okay, so a somewhat related topic. Peg is asking, your recent Chinatown dig turned up an artifact for a local Maynard resident, a copper tag with the name Tolentino. And is there somewhere that we can view that artifact?
So right now that artifact is in our collections in the one room that I've had to put all of my collections for this temporary move. So right now it's not visible to the public in person because of the temporary move, but I have photographed every single artifact from the Chinatown collection. And if I can type and talk at the same time, which I am really bad at, I think I can actually give you guys a link to that collection. Sorry. Sorry. So these are the 3 collections that we have fully digitized, including the Chinatown collection. These are kind of our smaller collections. So the Chinatown collection, the Malcolm X collection, and the Old North Crypt. So the photographs are in that in that link for all the collections in Chinatown. And we weren't able to get more information on the tag other than what was found during the dig from folks from Maynard who were really chiming in, incredibly helpful. What we believe happened, so there was just for background for folks that don't know what I'm talking about, we found a small metal tag that included the man's name Tolentino on it. I believe there's a number on it. If I remember right, there was an address that we found out was in Maynard. And what we think happened was that man owned this tag, and it was on an instrument. I can't remember if it was a trumpet or a trombone, that he was a musician. And we think that he either went to Chinatown and dined at the restaurant that was in Chinatown, or potentially was hired to go to that restaurant in Chinatown. We can't quite tell, as a musician. And the tag was found in the backyard. So we really don't quite know how the tag got there. It's one of the kind of mysteries of that project. But I forgot about that connection to Maynard in there. I remember the tag, I just forgot the Maynard connection. That's really interesting. Thank you, Peg, for remembering that and for bringing it up tonight. I really appreciate that. I'm gonna see if I can find Tolentino, if I can find that in the search.
So I'll be sure to send that link out with the recording link.
Yep. So the link I just posted is the entry for the Tolentino tag, and so you can see all the information about it. And the last thing on it is the photograph of the Tolentino tag.
Oh, that's great! Thank you.
Official beauty shot for our collections.
So Joe, I was wondering, I haven't had a chance to look at the book yet. If someone had a copy of the book, would they be able to do a walking tour of a certain number of the houses?
Yeah, within the book, there's a map that has a dot on the map where all the buildings are. There are very obvious clusters of the buildings in the north end and in downtown. There's a surprising cluster at the northern end of Dorchester as well. If you wanted to go see all 50 buildings, you're going to get to, I think, 11 different neighborhoods in Boston. And some of them are surprising. There's a house in Roslindale. There's 4 houses in Brighton and Allston. Some of the places I thought maybe would have houses that don't have them, like Hyde Park and West Roxbury, but Dorchester I think has 12 houses. So they're really spread out across the city, for better or worse. And if you wanted to do a walking tour of the downtown ones, you basically take the Freedom Trail. You're going to walk by most of them, but there's also a Charlestown cluster that's along Main Street in Charlestown, where I think there are 5 of them. and then a short distance away from that, another 3. So I'm actually in the process of working with the Northeast NEHGS, Northeast Historical Genealogical Society, on designing a walking tour with them that I'll be giving in October, I think, of this year in person. And Charlestown, I'm also doing designing a walking tour with them of their buildings in October. I think they're both in October, that I'll be giving in person. All of the events that I'm doing are, I will be posting them online. I'll post another link because today's the day of links. Every event related to the book is all going to be posted on this website, including walking tours and including tonight's event. And once they're available and I can link to the walking tours, I will be updating that page with the links so that you can register for them. But if you become if you sign up for the Northeast Genealogical Society's newsletters and the Charlestown Historical Society's newsletters, you'll get notifications about those as well.
Okay, that's great. One final question, Gail is asking, is the Blake House ever open to the public?
Yes, so the Blake House is owned by the Dorchester Historical Society, and I think it's the 3rd Sunday of every month. I should know because I used to be the caretaker of one of their houses. Their 3 houses are open to the public. I don't think they're doing it yet because of COVID, but it's a free tour. Highly recommend it. It's rare that you get to have a free tour of a 17th century house in Boston, and the Blake House is remarkably intact both on the inside and the outside. So I really recommend that you go and see it in person if you can. Just down the street is the Lemuel Clapp House, which is I think the 5th or the 6th oldest building in Boston, and the William Clapp House, which is an 1806 building. It doesn't make the list, but that's the house I used to take care of. All 3 of those houses are open every 3rd Sunday for free public tours. So you can do all 3 in one day if you really want to. You gotta hustle, but you can do them all in one day. And they're walkable distance. 2 of them are in the same yard, so that helps as well.
All right, that's great for good advice for some local adventures.
Wow.
I'm not seeing any more questions, so I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, Joe. It's been a pleasure to have you with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I really, really appreciate it.